I share with you guys a whole lot of amazing stuff to help out y'all's classrooms, and then we'll have a conversation along the way. So you guys know my shtick, all right? I really want to see you guys put stuff in the chat, whether it's questions, thoughts, resources. Hey, my cousin Eddie, he said something about cattle once, whatever. Just put it in there. It's useful for the crowd. And if you have questions, when I take a break and hand it to Chassidy or to Jay, I'm going to answer questions I can there, and we can circle back at the end too. So um, but let me dive right in to cattle drives. And I love talking about cattle drives because we get to talk about the cowboy, right? And I love this image. When I teach the Texas survey here at UNT, I always start with this image of the cowboy because this guy looks like what we think a cowboy is supposed to look like, right? He's rugged, he's got a mustache, and he's actually pulling it off, which is not easy to do with a mustache. He is armed to the teeth, right? He's got a 6-shooter. He's got his rifle there. The horse looks disinterested, but quite strong and could probably take him anywhere. And he looks like he's seen some stuff and could survive, right? And I always tell my students, this is our image of the cowboy, not because of what cowboys actually looked like in the 1870s or 1880s, but mostly because of how we've portrayed cowboys ever since the 1870s and 1880s, right? When film becomes its thing in especially the early 20th century, and then you get the spaghetti westerns, and especially after World War II and the Cold War, when the cowboy becomes this perfect image of America and rugged individualism and all that sort of stuff. Like, most of what we think we know about cowboys does not come from the era of cowboys. It comes from John Wayne. It comes from classic movies. It comes from Clint Eastwood and the outlaw Josie Wales, which is a great movie. Historically accurate, not so sure, but a fantastic film. And it continues. I mean, this fascination continues up to the modern day. I don't know how many of you guys saw 1883, but I will say that when 1883 came out, instantly in my Texas classroom, all of my students were experts on the Old West. And you could tell me everything about Fort Worth and Hell's Half Acre, and they had all kinds of things to say about it. I could go into 1883 and we could talk about that on its own sometime. But I want to say, like, there's an iconicness to this topic that is so important. And this is all about teaching, right? It's a great way to engage our students, right? They are often primed to want to talk about this topic and are fascinated by it. I know mine are when they get to my classroom at UNT. But this is what cowboys actually look like. This is a typical vision of what a cowboy in the 1880s or 1870s would look like, right? Which is, hardworking guys who are not necessarily cutting the mustaching figure. They're not armed to the teeth, and they're sitting on horses and are looking bored and sunburnt. I mean, it's not as glorious a story as it's often made out to be, but it's fascinating because it's connected to all the things that we've been talking about from last week, and we're going to continue talking about for the next couple of weeks. From cotton, cattle, and railroads, everything's tied together in ways that are really cool. So that's what today's session is going to be so much about, is tying together all these different threads that help our students see how history connects all kinds of people in ways you wouldn't expect, right? So for this first section, our essential question is, pray tell, what led to the explosive growth of the cattle industry in Texas after the Civil War? Because cattle's been in Texas, you guys know this, but cattle's been in Texas since the Spanish era, right? As a part of industry and things like that. When we think about the cattle era, we're really thinking about post-Civil War, 2 decades, 1870s and 1880s, and that's about it, all right? There's an explosion that happens then. Question is why, right? Part of the reason is what we talked about last week with the American Indian Wars and the pressure that's put on Native Americans, like White Eagle here, Santana, the Kiowa chief, you guys might remember from last week, right? And we talked all about that in detail, about how after the Civil War, there's a massive migration of people into Texas being brought westward who are putting new pressure on the American Indians. At the same time, you have the expansion of the railroads that we talked about briefly, right? That's putting new pressure on the Indians as well, because it's helping lead to the decimation of the bison/buffalo, whatever you want to call them, right? And all of that is producing this tension around Indians on both sides. that leads ultimately to war, right? We talked about Kiowas, the Comanches, the Apaches lashing out at the Salt Creek Massacre or at Adobe Walls in 1874. And then the U.S. Army responds, right? And we talked about that in detail. Here's our friend Rondell Slidell McKenzie over here, who leads the 5,000 cavalry troops that will ultimately end Indian power in Texas, the way we usually think of it, in the Red River War. It comes to an end in June of 1875 when the Comanches with Kawana Parker surrender to the U.S. Army, right? So that's where we left off last week, but it's the beginning point of us today, because if that doesn't happen, you don't have the cattle drives that then follow and the scale that they happen. Because what happens in the early 1870s is that the U.S. Army removes Native American groups from the plains, clears out this whole area right here you guys see on the map from Comanches, Apaches, Kiowa, Kiowa Apache, all these different groups. And when that opens that up, right, that then makes an opportunity for cattle, and particularly for cowboys, to move cattle through the plains with a freedom that they didn't have before. That opens up a whole new industry. So really, to get to the age of the cattle, that's the first step. All right, that's the first big thing that happens. Right, but it's not the only thing that happens. Right, cattle have also been there for a while. Why did they become a big deal right after the Civil War? Well, the main reason is that after the Civil War, so here's a map of the South and the North, right? After the Civil War, when the South and North are put back together, there's a whole lot of people in the northern United States. Not surprising you with this information. And they're hungry. And they, because of the railroad and because of the vast expansion of the railroad, they've developed a taste for beef from the Midwest, all right, and further west, that they would like more of. And so prices for beef that gets transported mostly out of Chicago, moving to the Northeast, all right, in large numbers, drives the price of beef up pretty significantly. So that right after the Civil War, a cow could sell in New York for $30 or $40 a head. Now, to put that into context for you guys, this cow right here would fetch $3 in Texas. So think about that. $3 in Texas, $40 in New York City. All right. Now, I'm not good at math, but I can do the profit margin on that, which is a pretty insanely massive profit margin, right? So there's suddenly, right after the Civil War, a ton of money to be made in moving cattle somehow to the Northeast. The Native Americans have been moved out of the plains, and it opens up this fantastic opportunity for entrepreneurs. And there's a whole lot of cattle to move. All right. Here's the other thing that's amazing. All right. And we don't talk about this usually, but it's a basic reality to make this happen. There are just a whole lot of cattle in Texas, like wild, out on the plains, walking around on their own cattle. Right. So you can see here this number. I always show this to my students. So in 1860, there's an estimated 3.7 million head of cattle. And it's an estimate because there was no cow census. Like, we didn't go around and count every single one of them. But roughly speaking, it's about a little more than 3.5 million head of cattle in the state. Now, to put that into context for you, that is 6 times more cows than people in Texas by the 1860s. All right. That's a lot of cows. That's a lot of them. And they're all just walking around doing cow things. And they're not owned by anyone for the most part. They're feral cattle. So it's like $40 bills, if such a thing existed, walking around on the plains. You just round up $40 bills and then you walk them to the bank, which is wherever you can sell those cattle, right? So in one sense, there's nothing profound here. They're not manufacturing something. They haven't discovered a gold mine. But in another sense, it's this historical moment, right, where the cattle have already been there. Suddenly a market shows up for them. At the same time, the plains open up and make it possible to bring the cattle to the Northeast. All right. All that comes together right after the Civil War, this moment of the early 1870s. Right. But here's the question. You've got all these $40 bills. They're worth nothing unless you can get them to market. All right. So how are you going to get cattle from Texas to New York City? Now, if you look at the map right here, you could put them on the railroad. That's what my students always say. It was like, just put them on the railroad. That's a good idea. There's a lot of railroads out there. I'm like, yes, there are, but you will notice there's no railroads in Texas. Not really, right? So look at this. So we're talking about cotton, cattle, and railroads, right? By 1870, there are a minuscule number of railroad lines in Texas. You guys can see it here on the map, right? There's 486 miles of track. I counted it up. And where are these rail lines? There's one little line here between East Texas and northern Louisiana. And then there's a couple lines down here around East Texas to Houston and Galveston. Why are those rail lines there? Well, it's because of another transformative thing that's actually happening in Texas at this time. There's a massive explosion in East Texas in logging and timber, right? And so you guys know about the East Piney Woods, right? First unit, we talk about geography, East Texas Piney Woods. There's millions upon millions of acres of forested woods out there. Still are the big thicket. It's a really amazing place. Well, after the Civil War, there's a massive industry that explodes of logging in East Texas, right? And this produces a massive amount of wealth in Texas and logging in East Texas. The first $1 million company in Texas actually emerges in the 1870s called the Kirby Lumber Company, producing 21 million board feet a year of lumber. I don't pretend to know what a board foot is, to be honest with you, but 21 million of it is a lot of lumber that they're producing, putting out there, all right? So that's why we have some rail lines in Texas, not very many, 486 miles. And you can see it doesn't really go anywhere. The one in East Texas goes from Jefferson basically over to where they can float logs down to New Orleans. And then the ones around Houston just take it down to Galveston so you can ship out lumber from there, all right? You can't put your cattle on there. So if you can't go that way, you can't put them on the rail line. You can't walk through East Texas because of the trees, right? And I know that's obvious to all of us, but it's really helpful to walk our students through that. Even my college students sometimes need to get walked through some of that logic to go, oh, that's why they go north, because that's the only direction they can go, right? The only thing you can do is walk northward, right? And head north from there. And that's when, oh, wow, people are drawing on this. That's kind of cool. Heading north from there, they got to go up. And where are they going to? Where are they walking to? The rail lines, right? And again, this is where the expansion of the railroad in the rest of the country affects Texas. Just because there's not a lot of rail lines in Texas doesn't mean the railroad doesn't matter in Texas. It does matter. It's just going to Kansas and it's heading west across the plains. But because it's close by and because it is on the plains, that opens up the possibility for walking north from there. So that, my friends, is what produces the first major cattle drives. There have been cattle drives before in smaller quantities. But after the Civil War is really the age of cattle drives starting in the 1870s. And basically people round up cattle, $40 bills, to walk them up to the bank / the railroad. And so they walk from there to, in this case, the first cattle drive actually doesn't go to Kansas. It goes, you can see right here, on the east side of this, the Sedalia Trail right here that goes past Austin, Fort Worth, and Denison. You guys following me here? This is the first major cattle drive post-Civil War. There's about 25,000 head of cattle that are led up this trail that's being forged in 1866, go through Arkansas into Missouri, and then they end at Sedalia, which is about where the railroad ended in 1866. All right, so that's why they go there. When they get there, deliver 25,000 head of cattle, they've made an obscene profit. What is 25,000 times 40? I'm not actually sure, but go do that math real fast. That'll tell you the profit that they made after they got there. Huge success. So the next year, the plan was, we're going to do that again. But when they decided to go back up the Sedalia Trail, this time they met a lot of angry farmers, particularly in Arkansas, who had shotguns and said, no, you're not walking through here. Because one thing, the cattle had trampled all everyone's fields. But for another thing, every time Texas cattle showed up, other animals, particularly grazing cattle in other places, died. And the reason was something called Texas fever. Nobody knew what it was at the time. It turned out to be a tick that Texas cattle would get in Texas, and they become immune to it when they got bitten when they're little. If you got bitten when you were older and didn't have immunity, other cattle would die. So everywhere Texas cattle went in Arkansas and Missouri, other cattle would die along the way. So that got shut down by angry farmers, and they had to move west. And so that's how we get the Chisholm Trail getting established the next year in 1867. So you guys see the Chisholm Trail here? It's about as straight a north-south shot as you can possibly get. And by this point, the rail lines had made it into Kansas and had gotten all the way to Abilene too. So that's how we get the Chisholm Trail emerging as one of the most famous and iconic trails in Texas history. Established by Jesse Chisholm, Cherokee trader. It becomes very popular for a lot of reasons, not at least of which is it's just north-south. It doesn't take a lot of directions to figure this out. But it doesn't cross a lot, besides the Red River, doesn't cross a lot of major rivers. And rivers were the biggest killer of cowboys and the biggest disruptor of cattle drives. So if you got a straight route with no rivers of any real size besides the Red River, that's a pretty good route. And so people started hauling cattle up the Chisholm Trail in massive numbers. You guys can see right here, there's an estimated 35,000 cows reach Abilene in 1867, going up the Chisholm Trail. That's going to double every single year. Double every year until 1871 when it reaches 600,000 head of cattle. Now, I just want to emphasize to you guys how many cows that is and how much money is going up, all right? At $40 a head, that is $24 million worth of cattle in 1871, which is $600 million today, roughly speaking, right? Think about that for a second. What an industry. What an explosion of wealth, right? And it's just cows walking around out there. You go round them up, you make a killing. Things are going to be great. And this makes people, right? In a way that nothing else could have. You were there. You had to be there at the right place at the right time. But if you were in a position to change your life forever, like this guy. And if anybody recognizes this character, this is Charles Goodnight. So I know you've heard of Charles Goodnight. All right. Charles here, Charles in Charge. No one remembers that show. Charles here was, his family moved to Texas during the end of the Republic of Texas, 1845. And they moved to the Brazos River bottoms area where his family grew cotton. So he grew up picking cotton. And if anybody's ever done that, you know that is brutal, horrific work. And he didn't want to do that after the Civil War. He gets involved in the early cattle industry. He starts making obscene amounts of money. So in 1871, he rounds up some cattle, heads north from there, and he clears $17,000 running cattle. Now, $17,000 in profit, by the way, is a lot of money today. I'll take $17,000. In 1871, that's about $400,000, just to put that into context for you, all right? He makes that all by himself. By the way, at a time, you guys know about Reconstruction, you guys know about post-Civil War South, right? Most people aren't making a ton of money in Texas at this time. So that's an explosion of wealth to be had, right? All right. And so Charles Goodnight gets involved. He has a partner named Oliver Loving, if you ever heard of him. Those guys are part of the basis for Larry McMurtry's novels about Lonesome Dove and such. But all kinds of trails get established out here, right? So there's a Goodnight Loving Trail that goes up to the Army bases in New Mexico and Colorado, the Potter Bacon Trail, which sounds delicious, the National Trail. Some poor guy named Jim Stinson looks very lost to me and heading just directly west. I hope he got wherever he was going. But with all these different trails and people and groups and all that good stuff, there's just an incredible number of cattle who are worth an obscene amount of money, who are going up and down these trails, and they're going through territory that used to be controlled by the Comanches, Apaches, the Kiowas, the Kiowa Apaches, all these different groups that the U.S. Army had cleared out. Or, you see these cattle trails? Where are they going through? Modern-day Oklahoma, which was known as Indian Territory because that's where all the reservations were. So when you think of cowboys and Indians and fights between these groups, a lot of it is because the cowboys are tramping through Indian reservations on their way up to Kansas or Colorado. All right. Now, to do this, and I think my students find the mechanics of all of this just absolutely fascinating. And they have this like beautifully romantic vision of what a cowboy life must have been like, the independence of it all, the excitement of walking cows places. And so I kind of try to walk through like, how did that actually work in practice? It's students just dial into that in a powerful way, right? But the way it would work is you would go to the plains and then increasingly towards South Texas in particular to round up wild cattle. You would typically round up somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3,000 head of cattle. Now, I want to ask you guys, and throw this in the chat for me. How many cowboys do you think you need to run 3,000 head of cattle? I would love asking my students that. Okay, 500. I like McKinsey. You're not going to mess around. 12, 50, 7 to 10, 15, 20, 40, 10, 10, 12. We're getting a consensus. 12 per 100. I like this. Someone's got a ratio. I think you're also a math teacher. I like that. 30. See, I'm an over organizer kind of person. I'm always afraid things are going to screw up. So I would get like way too many cowboys. This is a great exercise with students because then they got to think about it, right? And consider all the options. Typically, how many cattle you have? Anybody said about anywhere 8 to 12, you guys would have been right. You'd hire anywhere between 8 and 12 cowboys to run 3,000 animals. Think about that. This shows you how much the cows are not doing much except slowly walking. You only need 8 to 10 people to take 3,000 animals on a journey to Kansas somewhere, right? So they'd round up 3,000 head. They'd brand as many of them as they could get their hands on. So they say, these are ours. No one else gets to take these. And you'd set off from there, all right? Your most important job was to hire someone hilarious named Cookie to follow you in a chuck wagon to make sure that you are fed the entire way. And this is important because you're going to be living on whatever Cookie makes for anywhere between 6 weeks and 3 months. That's the typical range, which you can see is a pretty wide range. It just depends how far you're going. Kansas is closer. Colorado's farther. Montana, where some of these drives start getting to by the late 1880s, is quite far. That's going to be the 3-month journey. And that's the subject of Lonesome Dove. But you're taking all your food with you. All right. So this is a chuck wagon right here. And Charles Goodnight is credited with putting all kinds of innovations on chuck wagons. But all your food's on this thing, and you better enjoy it for the first 3 days because after that, it's going to have worms in it, and it's going to be disgusting. So it's going to be a long, long time you walking your cows. And that's what I always tell my students too. Like, the excitement of the cattle drive is done in about an hour because you're a glorified dog walker. You are walking very large dogs called cows, and they go very slowly. You're going to go at a blistering pace of 10, maybe 12 miles a day to Kansas. Can you imagine walking to Kansas at a pace of 10 miles a day on wormy food? Like that is the exciting, thrilling life of a cowboy. And depending on how long you've done it, you might have a terrible or a great seat for this ride because your rank in the cattle drive just depended on how long you've been doing it. Now the trail boss, that's the big guy. He's the one in charge. He's up front. Cookie and the chuck wagon over here, all right, trying to keep out of everything. The real important cowboys are point. They're the ones leading the way. And then the younger you are, the further back you are, because that's where you get cow dust and the smelling of the entire herd that is in front of you. The last thing you want to be is on drag, especially in a dusty period or a dusty area heading up from there, right? It is nasty, powerful work. And for that joy, all right, you get paid the princely sum of $40 a month. Now, think about that. That means it's one cow. You get one cow a month. That is what you earn on the cattle drive. You get your very own cow. So cowboys are cheap. Like if you're running a cattle drive, cowboys are cheap because you pay them one cow each. You're running 3,000 of them. So the profit margin here literally couldn't be higher for something you didn't even manufacture. You just gathered up on the plains. So these guys are going to get $40 a piece when they get to Abilene. They're 20 years old. They're probably going to blow it that particular night, getting drunk and having fun and all that sort of stuff. And that's if you get there. I mean, the cattle drive is dangerous, not because you're going to get into fights with the Comanches. The U.S. Army is taking care of that. But you probably will have a high chance of drowning in a river as you cross your way north along this way. You're not even allowed to carry firearms for the most part because cowboys, if they have firearms, if one of those goes off, you're going to start a stampede. So most cattle operations did not allow you to have a shotgun, a rifle, or a six-shooter in your belt. You're just riding around with your horse and your rope and trying to make sure the cattle go north from there. What I want to emphasize to you guys is these guys right here, these cowboys here, did not get rich doing any of this, right? But some people did. They are the cattle barons. And that is who emerges in this era, cattle mega ranches and the cattle barons. This right here is Charles Goodnight. And he is going to make an enormous amount of money on this. He's going to build a whole new era in the cattle industry that we're going to talk about in a second. So with that, I'm going to pause. And I'm going to hand the microphone over to my good friend and colleague, Chassidy, who's going to walk you guys through some resources.
Oh, I said howdy. It felt appropriate for the moment, considering the topic. Can everyone see my screen? Perfect. Thanks, Lorenzo. So I had a lot of fun with this one. I see you guys in the chat. This is also a fun topic for the kiddos. So I tried to be a little creative and give you some things outside of the norm. Hopefully add some new tools to your toolkit. Again, I'm the primary source junkie, and so I did a lot of combing and scouring different resource portals to find some cool things for you guys. So the first one, it's a hook activity. It's longer than a hook, and I did that intentionally because if you choose not to use it for a hook, you can always use it as a primary source analysis. But essentially, it's the point of this activity is to get the students to think about why people move to Texas today in comparison to during this time period. And so I found this really nifty, how do I move this toolbar? Sorry, let me try to move the toolbar at the top. I'll just reopen it. I found this really nifty primary source on the Texas portal. And so it's going to show up like this when you download it, but you have the ability to zoom all the way in. And so this activity actually focuses on getting the kiddos to zoom into certain portions, ultimately to get to the last question, which is why would Texas be a favorable place for someone interested in the cattle industry? And so you can sort of pilfer some of the clues from there, but ultimately once you get to this column here, where it's talking about wages and the cost of tools and the price of materials, they're really doing a great job selling Texas with this advertisement. And so it was a resource that I kind of got stuck on, and I really enjoyed it. And I was like, what can we do to really connect sort of geography, time, and space with a hook activity, and also something that's relevant today. The activity also gets kids to think about how does it compare to today? How do the reasons that you listed, so that maybe they may have listed weather or job opportunities, what sort of cross comparisons can one make? So y'all gotta excuse me because the toolbar is blocking all of the resources I have open. And anybody know how to close it? Kamiko, do you know how to get this toolbar?
You can drag it to the side, Chassidy. I don't think you can close it, but you can drag it over.
Beautiful. Okay, there we go. Let me just add it down here. It should be safe. Perfect. So that is the hook activity in the lesson plan. It walks you through the instructions, gives you some options. You can either project it on a large surface and do it whole group. You can blow up copies, chop it up, give kids certain pieces of it, and then also you can give them the link and they can use it on their own devices, or if you have tablets, and zoom in and zoom out. The handout that's linked here, as you see, walks you through the questions for analysis, takes you all the way through. So again, real cool if you're trying to integrate some past and present connections, but also a primary source. Texas fever, it's gross. Kids like it. And so I built out a primary source analysis activity on Texas fever with the hopes that you could use this as a hook without telling kids what is Texas fever. You can have them sort of guess, what do you think Texas fever occurred during this time period? What do you think it is? And the whole point is for them to be able to do some inquiry, to be able to figure out what is Texas fever. I pulled some resources from the Texas portal that kind of walks you through a investigation. So it gives you bits and pieces. You would want to conduct this activity in order with the documents going 1, 2, 3, 4, because ultimately by the time they get to document 4, they're like, oh, it was a disease caused by a tick, right? And so that's essentially what this little sort of a mini Q for the kiddos on Texas fever. So I feel like it's short enough to be a good engaging lesson or an enrichment activity if time is limited. But again, Texas fever is a topic that I really think the kids could get entrenched in. Last week I was reading the chat and I saw a lot of people like, oh, the images, this is going to make a great PowerPoint. Oh, and I'm like, well, let's go ahead and help them for week 2 and curate some of the images from Dr. Torget's presentation into a PowerPoint. And so it does not have all of the content, and in the lesson plan, it says teachers can modify this presentation. You can add content, subtract content, it's totally up to you. But I kind of gave you the nuts and bolts and I made it really pretty. So feel free to take it, grab it, use it. Lots of pictures kids can connect to. There's also a few animations in there for when you're explaining some of the slides. And the last part of the PowerPoint, I focused on the profile of a cowboy, because as Dr. Torget mentioned, when we think of a cowboy, we have this image in our head about who is a cowboy and what is a cowboy. But I wanted to ensure that students understood the diversity in that population. And so I talked about African Americans as cowboys, and then we have the vaqueros naturally, and then even women for the girls. And so in the lesson plan, on the other activities and resources, I laundry listed a bunch of websites to other portals and other web pages and some documents, some articles, if you wanted to build this out a little bit deeper, or maybe make some cards to go along with this activity. It's a processing activity strategy called a body biography. This kind of cross over into the creative writing, English language arts. And so essentially it's focused again on that diversity with the hopes that students choose some lesser known figures in the cow handling period. And so they go through this body biography doing research on a person who they select, and then they have to write these short statements related to different parts of the body. So there's the heart, which are like, what does this person love? What's close to their heart? Maybe they have a primary source where they're talking about their gal named Dolly back home, right? And then there's the backbone, like what did they have to stand up for? Was it themselves? Was it something else? The hands, the feet, the background, and then quotations. And then for the kids who like to draw, then there's this template. And so they would essentially be scribing different aspects, and then the instructions have them to decorate the background image. And then they also have the opportunity to like decorate their person if they want to do this. Great. Again, enrichment activity. In the lesson plan, I also gave some names of suggested lesser known cow handlers of different groups. So we have some African American cow handlers who became famous in Texas. We have some women, and then I also have Casimiro Chavarria, who was a cow handler in Texas. And there's lots of stuff in the portal. I tried to make sure that each one of these people was Googleable, so that way you can find interesting things about them. And then last but not least, I mean, I love cowboys, y'all. I'm a Western watcher, sorry. I didn't build this one out fully because the resources speak for themselves. If you really want kids to get into the zone, the mood of like, what were the cowboys really going through? These are links to resources, 2 of them from the Library of Congress and 1 of them from the portal, and they're primary sources. So this is a recording of a song called the Old Chisholm Trail. This resource right here, it's a document from the Library of Congress. It's kind of long, but there's a whole bunch of little short personal like narratives from all these cowboys. And so you can comb through it. You can pick a few and get kids to study them. It's really long, and I couldn't pick. It was like, I can't pick. There's too many to choose from. And so most of them are about the Chisholm Trail. So if you're doing a lesson about the Chisholm Trail, it's a great resource for you to pull some things from. And then lastly, in the portal, if you're going to talk about the roles of folks on the cattle drive, there's a primary source that it's the poem that a cowboy wrote about the positions and who they were. So it's a great, resource to show the kids as an engaging hook, or have them guess what's being talked about before you launch into the cattle drive. And that's all I got. Let me stop.
Right. All right. Well, that's a lot. Thank you, Chassidy. Fantastic. Love it. And I'm glad you brought up some stuff I couldn't actually talk in great detail about, which is African-American presence and the Mexican-American presence within the cattle drives and representation, especially the women on the cattle drives. I saw one person, Crystal, talked about in the chat about teaching it in all-girls school. And that's one of the things that the more we can have our students see themselves in the history and find that level of engagement, the more powerful it really is. I know my daughter is taking Texas history right now. I think I might have mentioned that last week. And so it'd be cool if she gets to see something like that as well. So I'm going to pass that along to her teacher, who is probably very sick of me at this point. All right, so let me dive back in, pick the story back up. So we left off with our friend Charles here, who the cowboys on his drives aren't making much money at all, but he's making a lot. And he's representing this rise of something that's also iconic about cattle in Texas, the mega ranches. So for the second section here, our central questions are, how did the rise of mega ranches change the cattle industry? Because it did in powerful ways. And then related to that, why did the age of the cattle drive come to an end by the 1890s? Because there's really just a 20-year, very short period when cattle drives are going on, even though it defines usually how we think about this time period, these cattlemen, and really the cattle industry then and since. All right. So to tell that story, we're going to hang out with Charles Goodnight here for a little bit. And Goodnight here, as I was saying earlier, was lucky. He's in the right place at the right time. And he takes advantage of, as do several other men, two free resources to make himself very, very wealthy. All right. So when I explain this to my students, I lay it out this way in particular. Two major free, openly accessible resources that Charles Goodnight and his buddies take advantage of that lead to the rise of mega ranches. All right. Free resource number one, plenty of free cattle out in the plains. All right. And again, I emphasize that to my students. It's not like they invented something. It's not like they created something. It's that they just found cattle that are already out there, 3.7 million plus, just walking around doing their thing. All right. So you don't have to go build some giant factory somewhere. It's just there. So they just round them up. And then the second thing, which goes back to, in my class, I always repeat the phrase endlessly, geography matters. Geography matters. Geography matters. Because it does. And it's really helpful for students to see those themes throughout. And this is another place where geography matters, right? The plains of Texas, which you guys probably talk about the very first unit in the class when you guys talk about geography, right? To sort of start everything off, like looping it back to why the plains matter. Here you have what's often called the open range, which is just a massive, long grasslands region. And when it's a grasslands region, it is just full of food that the longhorns can eat while they walk north, right? So not only did you just get free cattle, you have the perfect just open plains region to walk them where they feed themselves. I mean, you don't have to take care of longhorn. They're very tough, by the way, longhorn. They're very hardy animals. We don't eat longhorn today because their meat is actually quite tough compared to modern cattle. But this is a perfect opportunity for someone like Charles Goodnight to make a whole lot of money. And then, of course, you have the Indians having been defeated by the U.S. Army, having pushed them out of the plains. That opens up the plains, but it also makes the plains now accessible for people like Charles Goodnight to set up ranches there. all right? And that's where we have a big shift, all right? You've got the cattle, you've got the plains, and then with the Indians pushed out, you now have the opportunity for someone like Charles Goodnight to move in to something like Palo Duro Canyon, which we talked about Palo Duro Canyon last week, right? It was the last stand place for the Comanches and other Plains Indians in the Red River War. All right, that's where Slidell Mackenzie had chased them into the canyons in the plains of Texas up there, and had made it possible for Charles Goodnight to begin his operations. When they went into the canyon, they took out the Comanches. Who moves into the canyon the next year? Charles Goodnight. Actually, not even the next year. He moves in 3 months later. So Charles Goodnight moves into Palo Duro Canyon in September of 1875. Right? That is 3 months after the U.S. Army has removed the Native Americans out of Palo Duro Canyon. So you can see when they pull out the Indians, Charles Goodnight moves in and he uses the canyon as just a giant ranch, essentially. This becomes the basis of what's known as the Goodnight Ranch, right? And the Goodnight Ranch is huge, absolutely massive amounts of land, right? It is 1.3 million acres where he's using the walls of the canyon essentially to fence in his cattle and make this industry move fairly smoothly for him, right? And he's running a massive amount of cattle out there. Just to give you a sense of the scale, right? He has 100,000 head of cattle that he's running in his ranch by the mid 1870s. So at $40 a head, that's $4 million worth of beef walking around on his 1.3 million acres. In modern money today, that would be worth $111 million. So there are fortunes of a grand scale to be made. And when he makes that amount of money, then he's more able to buy land, buy rights, buy cattle, do all the things he wants to reinvest. And you can see, like, if you're an early mover here, you get a great advantage, right? And then you can just run headlong, as Charles Goodnight does, into building himself up into a major cattle operation, right? And so by the mid, and especially into the late 1870s, you have mega ranches that start springing up. So there's a really short period in the early 1870s, a very short period when you could just go round up cattle, walk them north, make some money, and have this opportunity. After just a few years, the big guys like Charles Goodnight start consolidating their resources and getting some of the best land and opportunities, all right? So Charles Goodnight, he's up here in the Panhandle. He's up here in Palo Duro Canyon, all right? He's got 1.3 million acres, and that's a lot of land. That's a big ranch. That's not the biggest ranch in Texas. Does anybody know what the biggest ranch in Texas was? Throw it in the chat if you know what the biggest. King, XIT, says Tara. King, XIT. All right, we got some people from the Panhandle. Yes, it is the XIT. The King is iconic. We'll talk about the King, I promise you. But it's not the biggest ranch that's ever existed in Texas. The biggest ranch was the XIT. And I love telling the story of the XIT ranch because it's just so tied into Texas in a way that you can see on the landscape today. So you see the building on the screen right now? This is what the capital of Texas, the Capitol building in Austin, looked like in the 1850s, right? Doesn't look like the modern Capitol. This is the modern Capitol. That's quite something. How did we get this modern Capitol? Well, first, this building here in the 1850s burned down because fires happen all the time and things burned down, so the Capitol burned. So in 1879, Texas needed a new Capitol building, but they didn't want to spend money on it. How are you going to raise enough money to have a big Capitol without actually spending anything? Well, the way they did it is that by late 1870s, the cattle industry is exploding. And there's a ton of money to be made in this, right? So to build this Capitol, our modern Capitol, which is a gorgeous, beautiful building, if you've never taken a tour of the Capitol, it's absolutely worth your time to do. The way that the state of Texas pays for this is that they take money from the cattle industry. And the way they do that is they sell a massive amount of public land in the Panhandle of Texas to the tune of 3 million acres, right? And that becomes known as the XIT Ranch. which the common parlance for the XIT is that it's 3 million acres spread across 10 counties. So you guys see the map right here? You can see the little blow up here at the bottom of the red. That's where all the counties are in the Panhandle, Texas. That's a 3 million acre tract spread across 10 counties. So that's the 10, Roman numeral X, I for in Texas, T for Texas. 10 in Texas, 10 counties, including all of Palmer County right here. Like that's just the whole thing is owned by the XIT ranch. And the XIT, in the late 1870s, early 1880s, it expands to be just as big as Charles Goodnight's operation. They have more land, but they're running also about 100,000 head of cattle, which you guys remember means roughly $111 million in today's money, right? That's a massive amount of money. And they're also making a ton of money in this whole operation. And what's really interesting to me about this, and that's something I emphasize to my students, is who's getting that money by the late 1870s, early 1880s? Who bought all that land? Because that's how we raised the money for the Capitol buildings. We sold all that land for the XIT ranch. But who bought it? Who paid for all that land? It wasn't Charles Goodnight. Who paid for it? It was investors, not from Texas. It was investors from Chicago, where they had all the slaughterhouses. So there's guys who own big slaughterhouses in Chicago that's processing all this beef and making all this money. They decide, hey, we could make a whole lot more if we owned the cattle from the very beginning and not have to buy it from people like Charles Goodnight. So they invest in Texas land in the 1870s, 1880s, and they get some of that money to do that from England. So it is actually British investors from London and Chicago slaughterhouses that combine their money to buy 3 million acres in the Texas Panhandle so they can make money on cattle. That makes it possible for us to build that massive capital that we have in Austin, Texas to this day, right? And I think that's so powerful because it demonstrates just how explosive this economic growth was in Texas, tied to cattle, tied to all this expansion. And it happened so fast, all within a decade, that by the late 1870s, it's no longer local Texans who can afford to do this. It is money all the way from London that is coming in and dominating the cattle industry in a massive, powerful, and long-lasting kind of way, right? Utterly powerful. So the XIT is the biggest ranch. Charles Goodnight's also up there with his 1.3 million acres. But what's the most iconic ranch? The most famous ranch in Texas? I'm not going to ask you to put in the chat. You guys all know what I'm talking about. It is the King Ranch, right? Which you can still tour today, or if you buy Ford, you can get the King Ranch version of your pickup truck, which makes them a lot of money modern day. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit of the story of the King Ranch. And there's a very similar story for the Kennedy Ranch, which is not as nationally known, but within Texas is justly famous for very similar reasons. So the guy you guys see sitting down in this picture on the left here, that is Richard King, all right? And the guy to the right of him standing up, that is Mifflin Kennedy. And these guys were friends. They both came to Texas about the same time, around the time of the U.S.-Mexico War. And Richard King, for being as iconic a Texan as he was actually born in New York. He was on his own from the time he was a very little boy. And, he's one of those rough and tumble types that kind of pulled himself up by his bootstraps. But by the time of the U.S.-Mexico War, he comes down to Texas, not because he's in the Army, not because he's interested in enlisting or being a part of that, because he wants to make money. And he wants to make money on the U.S. Army. So he runs boats up and down the Rio Grande, bringing supplies and whatnot back and forth between the U.S. Army and supply ships at the coast. Mifflin Kennedy here does something pretty similar, and they get to know each other, and they make friends, and they also fall in love with South Texas, which there's a lot to love about South Texas. But at this time, South Texas was not as irrigated as South Texas is today. And it was a much more rough scrabble kind of place. Not much rainfall, not necessarily the richest soil type situation to grow things. So it was a rough kind of area as far as you couldn't really farm it very well before modern agriculture. But they both end up buying land there, running all kinds of animals out there trying to make money off. this. So in the early 1850s, Richard King buys the first big tract that will become the center of the King Ranch. It's 53,000 acre tract that he gets for a pretty good deal because, again, land in this area is not as rich for agriculture as other areas. And he starts building slowly what will become the King Ranch. But the King Ranch in its early days is not the King Ranch that it's going to become. Right? He runs sheep, he runs cattle, he runs goats, he runs all kinds of stuff trying to make money. And he gets along. He doesn't do terribly, but he doesn't do great because there's not a giant market for most of this stuff. And it's so arid down there that you can't build massive herds very easily without a lot of land. So he continues to buy tracts of land, but he keeps experimenting with ways to make money. Until, bada-ba-boom, the post-Civil War period, right? And then the price of cattle goes through the roof from $3 a head to $40 a head. Suddenly he's sitting on an enormous amount of money. And so he starts running cattle. And what he does is he starts supplying people. He runs his own herds north toward Abilene. But what he also does, he becomes like a wholesale supplier. And he starts supplying herds to other cattle outfits in upper South Texas, if you want to call it that, or central Texas, moving it from there. And he'd sell to anybody who'd buy at any chance he'd get. He also collected herds from South Texas, northern Mexico. There's a lot of back and forth over the border that went on as part of that. But he'd start running massive numbers of herds. And so a lot of the industry in Texas kept moving further and further south into South Texas, the valley down here, and then northern Mexico in terms of rounding up feral cattle to put into the cattle herds and the cattle drives that are making their way north. And so these trails like the Chisholm Trail, all these different ones get further and further south down here, more directly into the King Ranch, and then at the same time, the Kennedy Ranch, which is going through a very similar sort of experience. And so as a result of that, the King Ranch blows up from the King's perspective in the best ways possible. You can see over the course of most of the 1870s and first half of the 1880s, King sends up 100,000 head of cattle from South Texas, all by himself. But you guys remember, at $40 a head, that's $111 million in modern money, right? That's a ton of money. And so Richard King reinvests that in his ranch. He reinvests that in his herds. He starts building up. He starts bringing in more cowboys. He brings in vaqueros from northern Mexico. He builds a whole kind of hacienda style little fiefdom for himself down there in South Texas. And then he does what a lot of the cattle barons start doing, which includes Goodnight, which includes the people on the XIT, is that the rise of these mega ranches have a big effect on the cattle industry, because when Goodnight's got all this money in cattle, XIT does, the King Ranch does, they want to protect their investments. They want to protect their herds. And so these mega ranches are some of the earliest investors in what becomes known as barbed wire, which is invented in 1873. And these are a bunch of different examples of different types of barbed wire. There was a long period of experimenting with different kinds of wires and barbs, how they would be most effective with cattle and all this sort of stuff. But as soon as it's invented, it's a cheap way to fence in a lot of territory pretty fast. And it is the cattle mega ranches that invest in it from the very beginning, right? And I want to emphasize something. When they do this, the mega ranchers are cutting off one of those free resources that they had taken advantage of, right? They are cutting off the open range. They're fencing it in, the old song, don't fence me in. But like, that's literally what they're doing, because they want to control the best parts of the cattle ranges heading north to protect their own investments, right? So it's kind of like they ran up the economic ladder, and then they pulled the ladder up behind them because nobody else can follow, because they're taking away one of these major resources, all right? And so starting in the mid-1870s, there's an increased number of fencing that goes on, some being done around those ranches, but a lot of the fencing is actually happening out on the plains. And they didn't just fence in the entire plains. They didn't just run fence for 40 miles. What they would do is that people like King or Kennedy or whomever, they would go buy the land from the state of Texas that was the best crossing of a particular river. Or they buy the best water hole, or all the water holes. They buy all the good resources out on the plains, because plains are big, plains are full of grass, but you got to get to the water holes. You got to have the good places to cross rivers, or you're not going to be able to make the drive north all the way up to Kansas or wherever you're going to get the railroad, right? So they'd buy those particular places, they'd put barbed wire around it so they could control it, and that effectively cuts off the ability of small timers, new cattle guys, from getting into the game and taking advantage of those resources and making the kinds of profits that Goodnight had made, King is going to make, or anybody in the XIT is trying to make. All right. So this gets to produce this back and forth fight with the people who are putting up the fences, and leads to what I like to call the fence wars. All right, where fences are put up all over Texas, and then small-time cattlemen or wannabe cattlemen, wannabe ranchers, start cutting down the fences every chance they get, because they feel like this is an affront basically to public property. You can't put up these fences, so they just cut the fences. The landowners don't like that, and so they not only put up the fences, but then they hire patrols to make sure fences don't get cut. And so there's this fighting back and forth that explodes across Texas that gets to be really vicious and violent by the early, especially by the early 1880s. All right. So I pulled this newspaper from the portal, because you can find anything on the portal real fast. It's amazing. This is from a San Antonio paper you guys can see from December of 1883. And it's a mass meeting, tremendous outpouring at Kirch Hall last evening. What's everybody so excited about? Fences. Everybody's coming in because they want to yell, scream, and stomp their feet about what's happening to fences. And it's really interesting. If you read the article, there's all this back and forth between these little groups. It almost sounds like it's like these groups going back and forth. It sounds like West Side Story, except it's not quite that romantic. The Javelinas versus the Blue Devils, of who's cutting what fences and things like that. It's actually kind of a hilarious article to read. But by 1883, when this newspaper article comes out, there are incidences of fence cutting and violence associated with fence cutting in half of all Texas counties. All right, so this is widespread, violent business because there's so much money at stake, and people feel obviously deeply strongly about it. The very next year, in 1884, the Texas State Legislature had a special session of the legislature simply to consider the problem of fence cutting and what they're going to do about it. So they passed more laws outlawing it. What did that accomplish? Absolutely nothing, because people kept cutting fences, and there's not a patrol out on the plains that's very effective. And so it just keeps going. So the effect of that is important. It's because barbed wire is a technology. Technology is part of what ends the cattle drives because of the use of barbed wire. But it's also much more specifically because these guys who got so much money so quickly and create the mega ranches then try to close off access to all of these resources. And so the Chisholm Trail, which it says 1867, 1872 here, but it actually goes up to 1884. The Chisholm Trail is active up until 1884, and then it basically shuts down. And there's no like official like, hey, we closed the Chisholm Trail, not for operation anymore. But it effectively stops being used because of fencing in particular. All right. So why does the cattle industry or the cattle drive period come to an end finally by the late 1880s? Part of it is fencing. And then part of it, the other thing, is the massive expansion of railroads. And this is, again, where cotton, cattle, and railroads, all these things are going to be intertwined with each other. We're going to talk about how cotton is tied to railroads here next week. But with the expansion of the railroads during this period, there's no more need for the cattle drive in the same way it had been before, right? So look at the map. There's two maps that I've got up here right now. In 1870, you can see we've got barely anything. We've got 486 miles of track. There's just nothing in Texas. But 20 years later, look at the map. There are 8,000 miles of rail lines that have been run by 1890. 8,000 miles of rail line. And what I think is really interesting about this is, where do the railroads go? Well, obviously East Texas. They're going in all the places that people live. That's part of it. You can see Houston, you can see Dallas and Fort Worth up here, right? But they also come down here into South Texas. Why? It's for the cattle, right? Why do they go out to the plains? Why are they going all the way out here to modern day, Amarillo, Lubbock, all those places up there? They're not going for the view. They're going for the Goodnight Ranch. They're going for the XIT. They're being connected to those places up there. And once you no longer need to get on the railroad, you no longer need the cattle trains. Now, the funny thing about this is that the railroad started jacking up the price they charged for shipping cattle. So even when the railroad came out to some of these places, some of these guys kept trying to use cowboys to drive them north instead of using the railroad because it turned out to be cheaper once the railroad jacked up the prices. So sometimes it wasn't always the favorite thing of Charles Goodnight and others to use the railroad, but that only lasted a very short time. And then after a while, they just kind of give into the inevitable that they're going to be using the railroads. And so the era of the cattle drive comes to an end. The era of the cowboy doesn't, of course. These mega ranches will continue. Cattle industry is still a big deal in Texas, as you guys know. Anyone who's from the Panhandle knows there's cotton out there, but there's also cattle in a big and powerful way out there. Those industries survive. But here's something I want to end with. As powerful as it is as an industry, as indelible a mark as it's made on Texas, both how people think about Texas, our state capital, all the King Ranch just as an emblem of Texas, all those things are very, very important. But it didn't affect, in terms of numbers of people, massive numbers of people. And that's something else when we give context to our students is important to remember. Because how many, again, going back, how many cowboys did you need for a cattle drive? About 10. It's not like you need thousands or tens of thousands. And we remember from last week that was putting pressure on the Indians. You have literally 800,000 people that move into Texas in the 1870s and going into the 1880s. Population is expanding. A small number of them are getting into cattle, but most of them aren't. Most of them instead are getting into another industry that's been in Texas also a very, very long time, that's shaping the state. They're getting into cotton. And cotton is going to be tied into the railroads as well, the expansion of all of these territories, this massive influx of people that's going to reshape how Texas and Texans experience this entire period. It's happening all again at the very same time, which is a story that we're going to pick up next week when we get to that. So with that, I'm going to my good friend Jay, who's going to walk you guys through some more resources on the second half materials.
All right, thank you. So in Schoology, you see the part 2, you see the lesson plan and additional items. And what I wanted to show you is the tools that we have, or the lesson plan itself, and playing off of, the mega ranches. I have a hook exercise. I have a PowerPoint presentation talking about mega ranches, and I could have gone 50 different ways with ranches. I just kind of picked some stuff that we talked about this evening, but I also found a really good resource from the SMS Ranch, as well as the 4.6s, and definitely got to mention the King Ranch because that's like a Texas icon anyways. But the hook exercises are really interesting. I've discovered this document called Glimpse of a Ranch, the story of the SMS Ranch. The book is in the portal. I've hyperlinked it in the very bottom end of the additional resources, the story of the SMS Ranch. It's a really fascinating read. They give a ton. If you're going to look for primary source document pictures of a ranch life, you got to go here because this was truly fascinating. But this is just really kind of talking about, what ranch was like, being on a mega ranch. And it really changed my outlook. I thought ranch life was, they would go to the bunkhouse, do their thing, and then go out during the day and do all this stuff. Ranch life was just almost like being on a cattle drive. You started from March and went all the way to December. And you're out on the field with the chuck wagon and everything else that kind of trails along with you, moving the cattle from place to place or the horses from place to place. So I have this primary source document that kind of takes excerpts from the story I really found it was interesting about bond between horses that the cowboys had to know every one of the horses' names, as well as their characteristics, how they were different from the other horses. So it kind of gives you a good idea. And then this one I didn't know. Hollywood is, as Dr. Torget mentioned, Hollywood has tainted me. I mean, I grew up, revering John Wayne as the greatest cowboy of all time. But I didn't realize that they actually would sing to the cattle when they were out at night to keep the cattle calm. So this was a really big, deep dive. As Chassidy's talking about, I found out a lot of really cool stuff about ranch life, and it completely changed my mind of what I thought ranch life was like. And then I picked up some lingo, some things, raring to go, and just various little items like laying them down, which is synonym for death. We're laying them down. So I thought that was really kind of fascinating from that point. The story of the SMS Ranch is, like I said, it's a really good read. This is from the portal. And it has a ton of images that you can pull from that you can definitely want to add to your PowerPoint presentations as well too. The PowerPoint on the Texas ranches, like I said, I could have gone 50 different ways, but really what I wanted to do is just talk about, what we've already taught the kids about Texas ranching. Want to talk about one of the very first ranches, which was attached to the Mission San Francisco de la Espada, Rancho de las Cabrillas, which was ultimately owned by a Tejina. Her husband was tragically killed, which rumor has it by their nephew, but I couldn't find much about that. But she was influential in exerting laws to ensure that women were able to operate their own businesses, which also include ranches. And then first Anglo ranches, Martin Varner, one of Austin's old 300, bringing ranching in. He would take his cattle from East Texas to Louisiana, which seems like a really tough trek to go across the swamps. Then we bring in the mega ranches. I do spend some time on XIT. When I was thinking about doing this, I was thinking about my own seventh graders. I mean, I could go, Torget's approach to this is phenomenal. I think for my seventh graders, a little bit over their heads. So I kind of stuck with, all right, where is it? How big is it? When at its height, what did it look like? What the Capital Syndicate, kind of talk about that piece of it. And then kind of talk about where it is now today and what happened to it. I obviously bring in the JA Ranch, talk about Goodnight. And then I do want to spend some time on Mary Ann Goodnight and Charles actually picking up some of the orphan bison. And I spent some time talking about what they did and where they're at right now. I was fortunate to go to Caprock Canyon State Park and was able to see this bison herd. It is breathtaking, to say the least. I pulled from Fins and Fur. If you haven't seen this is the one that Matthew McConaughey's narrating. This is really a short episode just on the buffalo, on how resilient. Got to talk about King Ranch, spend some time with that. And then I brought in Matador because I felt like that was a sizable ranch at its day and time. And then the 4/6s. I mean, with everything going on with Yellowstone and 1883 and all that, I know the kids know about 4/6s because even I had my kids ask me that. So I spend a little bit of time with that as well too. I don't mention Taylor Sheridan in his group, but I just talk about it. And then the Swinson ranches, which is really the SMS ranches of of Texas. And it really kind of talks about how the Dutch or Swedish immigrant comes in with his family and amasses a sizable ranch. And then I bring in the Taylor Stevenson Ranch. This is a small Black-owned ranch that's been in the 4th generation. There's not, sadly, enough history on this family. They spend most of their time promoting their own history, which I think is fortunate for us to at least pick this up. But this is where we have a really good story of a white man who marries a woman who is enslaved to his family, and ultimately they decide to live together in matrimony, and which was during Reconstruction was a tough time to do that. And their ranch is still functioning today. Chassidy and I were talking about it not too long ago, just outside of Houston, which is a really fascinating one. So I bring in a little bit of Tejano or Tejina, and then we bring in African Americans as well too. I always end up with my essential questions in the back end, have my kids turn around and discuss and have that conversation. Which is important. And then Making of a Cowboy, still pulling from the autobiography of various individuals. This is truly, my red squigglies is my Grammarly picking up on this. So this comes directly from the primary source, tried to turn it into just a little reader rather than turn it into primary source. This is a story of a boy who walks from Virginia to join the SMS ranch. That's his whole goal. But in the very end, he rides a prized bull, and he wins the prize. So it's a really good read. I've flipped this over to a couple colleagues here in my district, and they love it. They think it's a really good one. And then the Fence Wars, that's a tough one. I like Dr. Torget's approach to it. I take one lady, Mabel Doss Day, who was a owner of a ranch that her husband, she inherited from her husband, 85,000 acres, to where she faced fence cutting. And she was pivotal in stepping into Austin to pass a law that made fence cutting a felony. So wanted to bring that little piece into it. And again, you could cut and paste these into a PowerPoint. You can turn things around with it. But your lesson plan, I've got all of that. And then lastly, one of the things that from a previous program that we've done, the End of the Buffalo, this is not my creation, but this is another cohort's creation that talks about the End of the Buffalo from that, just so the kids could see that piece of it. But that is what I have for you guys. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Torget. Looks like we're ahead of schedule.
Oh, actually, thank you, Jay. That's beautiful. We're right on schedule.